Welcome back to another episode of Better Than I Found It, the podcast that is all things college golf. Today's guest, admittedly, isn't much of a golfer, but Todd Gongwer is an incredible leader, author, and motivational speaker. Todd is the author of one of my favorite all-time books on leadership entitled Lead for God's Sake, and I truly believe that all coaches and athletes will benefit from this interview. Enjoy the listening. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Better Than I Found It, the podcast that is all things college golf. Today I have a very special guest. He's an author, motivational speaker, actually a former coach, a really good friend of mine who's written one of the best books I've ever read on leadership called Lead for God's Sake. He wrote it about 10 years ago. And the author I'm talking about is my good friend, Todd Gongwer. Todd, welcome to the podcast today.
Hey, Coach. Thanks so much for having me. It is awesome to be here. Awesome to be able to catch up with you a little bit, too. So it's been too long for us. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. It's really been since before the pandemic. You were here, actually spoke to our team, and you spoke to a lot of teams that week when you're here at Baylor. And but I want to say thank you for that. Thank you for what I consider one of the best books on leadership I've ever read. And I told you earlier, I've only read 3 parables in my life. I read true stories. I read biographies. I read history. I read, things need to be real for me to read them. I'm not a fantasy guy. So I realized this book, Lead for God's Sake, wasn't a true story, but to me, it paralleled every single coach's career at some point. Everybody goes to that place. I was at that place. So I want to thank you publicly in front of my listeners here for a great book, which I'm going to tell them how they can get that later. But Lead for God's Sake was a book that was handed to me by my assistant coach, Brian Goots, at Oklahoma State, literally about a week before I was let go at Oklahoma State. And I must confess, I didn't read the book in those 7 days. But he handed me the book because I think on some level, Brian knew, and he had read it because his wife had given it to him. And he knew I needed to read this book. So Brian Goots, thank you for giving me that book back in 2013. And it's called Lead for God's Sake. Let's talk a little bit about it. Todd, I know the book was written over 10 years ago, but it is still impacting coaches and other people throughout the world.
For sure.
But tell me this. So what was the original kind of motivation for wanting to write it? Because you had been a coach.
Right.
Tell me about
it. Yeah. So if we go even back into like the 90s, all through the 90s, and I was assistant college basketball coach at small college in Northern Indiana, Bethel College. And then at the same time, it was an NAIA school. So I was able to I had to keep my day job in the business world, which, I've always been in the business world my whole life. I grew up as a part of a family business and tremendously passionate about both sports and business. And so it really through the 90s was a perfect mix for me because I could I could get up early, be at work all day, and then in the afternoon go at that kind of that outlet and practice. And then in the evening recruiting, and then we're on the road for games and things like that. So, but through that time, I really developed a tremendous passion for, the topic of leadership, culture, and team dynamics. And I tell people out of necessity more than anything else. Here we were trying, as a coach, you're always, and I was assistant, but we were trying to build, obviously, the best team dynamic possible. And then at the same time, I'm over here in the business world, and I was actually building kind of a franchise arm of our business. So I was hiring people and putting teams together and things. And so I became obsessed with really reading and studying the topic of leadership too. So those 3 things, the reading, the sports, and the business, all kind of began to shape this passion in my heart for, and really what I felt eventually as a kind of a call to the deeper elements of leadership and team dynamics. Everybody's talking about, there are all kinds of ways to get people to do what you want them to do, and in terms of the basics of leadership. But for me, it became, kind of this deep passion to really find the foundation of those things. And that was where, really over the years and even in my own life, my pursuits, even as a coach and a business person were off. But I started to recognize just how powerful my why, my purpose was. And eventually that led me to, actually in 2004, when I stepped away from the coaching world, was brought into to an organization to help transform their culture, and did that for 5 years. Actually, we eventually were bought by a public company, so I was able to do that for a few years there. But all of those experiences, I had been studying and then started to write, and eventually came this these philosophies, which I feel God really laid on my heart. And because he had to open my eyes first to some things that I needed to change in my heart. And then eventually it became really clear that, I'm supposed to write this book. And I don't know who, at the time I had no, really no platform or anything like that, but I really felt called to write it. And so, that it came out like a parable. I know you and I've talked about this before, but I'm with you. I didn't read a lot of parables back in the day. I want something to be real and have depth, and not that they're not, but I was really, again, for me, I tried to write it. In fact, I struggled for like 2 weeks trying to write a regular leadership book, just step one, step two, and nothing came out. Felt like God really said, start over with a short story. And I'm thinking, I don't have a clue how to write, a short story, but I guess maybe a chapter or two I can do, and then I'll write my commentary. And literally when this story started coming out, it was so real and so, it's hard for me to describe kind of what it felt like as it was coming out of my heart. And I just kept flowing, and the story just kept evolving into what it actually ended up being. And I knew halfway through it that I was like, this is way bigger than me and beyond what I could do on my own. I'm getting a ton of help from above. I could tell clearly. And as it came out, that was confirmed.
I've read a lot of leadership books, and a lot of them are step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and that's good information. But I don't think those touch your heart quite like a story about. And so if I may read from the inside dust jacket on the book about this coach that you write about, which I'm sure you had a coach similar to him, or you wouldn't have come up with that. So Todd, let me read from the inside dust jacket on Lead for God's Sake. Although he's one of the most successful high school basketball coaches in Kentucky's history, Steve Rocker, for the first time in his life, is falling short of expectations. His players have lost their will to win, their love for their teammates, and their passion to play. Coach Rocker's motivational methods that have always worked before and have resulted in his success are now failing, and he doesn't know why. When I read that, it's almost as if you had been writing the book about me. Because at Oklahoma State, the last 2 or 3 years I was there, and it's been very well documented in a book I wrote, but also in several of these podcasts that I've done, it's like that was a dark time for me. And it sounds like Steve Rocker was in a very, very dark place for a guy who'd been so successful. And I look back on that moment in time. I know why my assistant coach gave me your book. It's like, Coach, this is you right here. You need to read this to at least make it more clear to you. This isn't working what you're doing. It's not, and you're not having any fun. So tell me about Steve Rocker. How'd you come up with that character?
Yeah, it's so interesting when you when you share that. I think that's been one of the coolest parts of the journey is how many coaches, and you alluded to this earlier, every coach really does. Sometimes they don't realize it, but goes through that dark time or battles that balance of, obsession, going over the top with, I have to win, I have to win, I have to win. And so, I had a number of coaches over the course of my time, as a player, both in high school and even a few years in college. I was a walk-on scrub. So, it's kind of down at the end of the bench, but I also, had the opportunity in the 12 years that I was coaching in college basketball. I had the opportunity to coach with what I would tell you is one of the most purpose-driven, just he's a phenomenal coach in terms of doing it the right way. I watched him battle just like every other coach I've ever seen, but I also watched a lot of other coaches over the years during that time. And so, when I get asked about who did you write it about, I always tell people, I say, most importantly, and I've seen coaches battle this, but the reality is I, in my own heart, was struggling with the exact same things. I mean, I remember, not handling, and I was one of the younger coaches back then. So kind of a relationship guy, kind of one that could connect with the players. And yet there was times when I just, I had it out of balance. And so I tell people, I said, more than anything, I was writing about myself, where my heart was. But I said, I'm also writing about where I believe 99% of every coach that I've ever been around or watched has been. And so Urban Meyer told me that when he read it. Steve Alford told me that. Lane Kiffin told me that. Travis Ford, if you remember the Kentucky basketball, because he really related to it growing up in Kentucky and being, there's just so many coaches over the years that have reached out and been like, wait a minute, you wrote that about me. And I'm like, I did. I wrote that about you. And I think that was the beauty of kind of how it came out.
Well, I don't know how far you want to get into the book, because I don't want to spoil the book for any of my listeners that don't have it and would go out and actually buy it. But it's not an unusual story, as we've documented. Every coach goes there, but kind of how this coach comes out of it, how Steve Rocker eventually comes out of this, is very unusual. And it's from the janitor at the school, the custodian, and his wisdom. It's like everybody knows this custodian, this janitor, this person in their lives, but sometimes you just you're not intuitive enough to realize this person is giving you this wisdom. So tell me how he kind of got into the story, because that to me was, you didn't introduce him until later in the book. And it was like, wow, this guy's amazing. I've met guys like that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a couple things that I think about it. One, because I get asked a lot. The next question is, okay, who is the coach? And then they're like, okay, who is the janitor in your life? Who is that? And I'm like, I have, as I've been later in life, into my 20s, 30, whatever, I had some really good, I mentioned the coach that I worked for years, great mentors, great, kind of Joes. But I think as much as anything, I never really had that. I never feel like I had that growing up, whether it was in junior high or high school, and I missed that. And so I think maybe there was, in hindsight, maybe there was a part of a void there, and why he came out to be the kind of, heartfelt listener and just deep, compassionate, caring, with a lot of wisdom person that he was. But the other thing I think is a key there with that gender, and even with the whole theme of the book, that I think, usually takes people a while to actually, dive into this one as being, the central concept, and purpose and leadership and all those things are kind of the overarching themes. But self-awareness is maybe, if not the biggest turning point and key to all of this. I always tell people, open eyes begin with an open heart. And, how do we open our heart to the truth? And that was what Joe helped with. And I always tell people, because now when I do workshops and I do, breakout stuff where we really dive deeper into getting to what is shaping the heart of your leadership. One of the huge things that I say is, we all need a Joe. We all need that person in our lives, and not just a critical person, not just a person to say, and a lot of folks in coaching, they say, well, my spouse is that person. I said, well, that's great, but a key component of that person is they have to have a relationship with the people, or at least a deep knowledge of the other people you're leading to. And oftentimes our spouses, they don't have a deep relationship with the people we're leading at work. And so they can call us a bonehead at home for all the things that we're doing at home wrong.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
But sometimes we can fake how we're doing, they may not catch all of that. And I just, that's such a critical component. And, Mike, we miss it in the sports world and the business world. And I know you know this, but this is where, I've shifted in the last 5-6 years and kind of in what my focus is in terms of how I work with teams and coaches is the head coaching spot in any college sport, really in any sport, is to some extent, to different extents, but it's a lonely spot because you have your players, you have your administration, you have your donors or your or your fans. You have all these. For you guys, you have the NCAA. You've got all these different components around you that you, in essence, in some way, have to answer to, and none of them can you be completely vulnerable with, because it can really be a tough situation if you are.
For sure.
You have to have vulnerability, but it's hard to find that balance, and that's where more and more I've gravitated toward kind of being, that's my passion. I love to come in and speak to the teams and even work with the coaching staffs, but more and more I've really gravitated, and that's what I want to do for the next 30 years. I've gravitated to being, even with some of the ADs going, hey, who are the coaches that I can really help pour into? Because they need that person that's kind of an outside voice that understands the inside, and that can really connect with all parties around them and really relate to them to help them, find that, to help them operate in that Joe realm, so to speak. So,
well, that's good that you say that. I have given your book to 10 people. I've read it 5 times myself. So it's a book that still continues to kind of impact what I'm doing. I have had some coaches that are just blown away by it, but I've also had some coaches say, well, that's all fine and dandy, but I've got to keep my job. So I can't just love and just go to their heart and do all this. I got to keep my job. So I'm going to be tough on them and whatever. So I want you to speak to those coaches, because there is a balance. Tough love, being stern, being strict when you need to be, but showing the love and going straight to the heart of that player is paramount to me.
Yeah.
What do you say to those coaches that say, well, I've got to keep my job, I can't just love on them?
Well, this might, there's a couple of coaches out there that, I've watched, and even I've watched them be maybe somewhere close to the verge of either a breakdown or potentially losing their job. They're going through a struggling season. And, I can tell you that it's funny because I always like to use the golf analogy. For us amateur golfers, you probably can't relate to this, but for those of us that are amateur golfers, when we get ticked off, when things go bad on the golf course, what we do. We squeeze the club tighter.
Oh yeah.
And we swing it harder. And you also know exactly what happens when we do that, right? It doesn't get better. It gets worse.
For sure.
And so many coaches, that's the natural default. We go to our default. But what I've seen multiple times, and Gary Gilmore's a great example at Coastal Carolina baseball team. They won the College World Series a few years back. And in fact, Brian O'Connor at Virginia was in a similar situation. Those guys were going through really, really tough seasons. And they had walked down that path of where they were squeezing the club tighter and swinging, going after that. I've got to control. I've got to keep my job. And they went through what both of them would tell you. And at large in part, as a result of the book, they kind of had a heart change and kind of opened their eyes to some new things. And I was able to, interact with both those guys at different times, but both of them would tell you it was more of okay, we got to trust the heart here. We got to trust the heart and trust these, and that's the hardest time sometimes. But in both cases, those are two great examples. Both cases would tell you, when they learn to kind of go, okay, I'm going to love these kids. And if this is my last year, or if we have a horrible year, I'm going to at least help them enjoy it. And I'm going to show them how much I love them. We're going to build trust. And I'm going to tell them, show them I believe in them. And in both cases, those teams won the College World Series that season. And so I know, and baseball, baseball coaches in general, I joke with those guys all the time because they're probably not a lot unlike a lot of golf coaches. They're not the emotional like football and basketball guys. They're way up and down. They're mercurial. They're flying out of the. You can't do that in baseball or golf. As a general rule. And but the reality is it comes down to what's your real why. And if you really do genuinely care about these kids, I know you want to keep that job, but at what price? And at some point, you get to a point, I think, in these cases, and there's been other cases too, where, these guys have been like, you know what? I'm going to love these kids. This is my purpose. This is why I'm here. And I'm going to trust the process. And from a faith standpoint, I can even tell you, Tony Bennett's a great example of that coming true, where he went through losing in the first round of the, and I know he just, his heart that season and the season after when they won was, I've got to love these kids even more. I've got to help get these character principles, the pillars of their culture. I've got to really focus on those things more than anything else. And I'm going to trust the process to take care of itself. And it does, it doesn't always work just like that, but I'm going to tell you, oftentimes it does. And, if you've been in coaching long enough to know, there's a lot of factors going into those people that are winning national championships.
Oh yeah. And
a lot of factors.
A lot of things have to happen right that may or may not happen other seasons, but
that's exactly right.
One of the things about loving a player is also holding them accountable and keeping to a standard. If they say they want to do one thing, I want to play the PGA Tour. And I think my only regrets in coaching, truly only regrets, are when I didn't hold a kid accountable to what his dreams were. And so that's part of loving him too, is being tough with him sometimes. But it's not out of panic by any stretch. This is just the deal. What do you think about that?
I think I'm so glad you mentioned that, Mike, because I 100%, and I've been around so many, that's one of the greatest blessings of the last kind of 11 years of this journey is how many, very ultra successful programs I've been able to be around and watch these coaches and watch and learn from how they're doing. And there is a high level of accountability. Excellence is absolutely, the standard. And I think that's so important. If we genuinely love someone, we absolutely want the very best for them. And so we have to, just like with our kids, we hold them accountable to those high standards because we want the very best for them. So I think that's a key component. You mentioned, not out of panic. And, where I always challenge the coaches is the kids will know why you're doing it. They'll be able to see through you. If you have established the relationship with them, or even, in these football programs where they got 100 and some kids, established hierarchically kind of so that there's a trickle throughout that your coaches know and everybody else knows. That's a big part of it too. But if there's an overarching theme of genuine love there, those kids will embrace that accountability to a much deeper level, I believe. And that's what I've seen. So I think you're spot on. I'm glad you
I've seen that in my career as well. So I had another question for you relative to, because you're also a businessman. I mean, you're a life coach, motivational speaker, you're a former coach, but you're also in the business world. So I know you've managed people in the business world. So describe how managing people in a business sense is very similar or the same thing as coaching a basketball team or a golf team.
Yeah, it's it's interesting. That's a really interesting study. I've always said there's so many parallels. I think the parallels nowadays, to use something from the book where we talk about the hatchets and treasures, or the fears and rewards that we're going after. I think nowadays more than ever, both in the sports world and the business world, the hatchets and treasures have grown. The treasures for the obsession with getting the college scholarship and getting to the next level, playing professionally, the treasures have grown so much that really is hard to keep those in proper perspective. And that's the same way it is in the business world, especially with this last year. I mentioned I'm working with a group now. I had a team of about 30 people responsible for about another 100 that are kind of dotted line to that group, responsible for 11,000 people here this last year. And so it reminded me, got me back into directly leading people really deep into the trenches. And the biggest thing I'd tell you is, you got the fears from what's going on with COVID and anxiety that our media is constantly feeding. So there's a ton of fears out there right now. And then on top of that, with the labor market the way it is, you have treasure going through the roof because salaries and comp has just gone through the roof in the last 2 years because we're at such a labor shortage. We've pushed so much out into the economy that unfortunately a lot of folks didn't have to go back and didn't go back for a lot longer than they maybe would have or could have. And so, that made for some really just real challenges of now more than ever, building the relationship with people, because those treasures and those fears are looming larger than ever. And again, I'll go back to say, building the relationships are tough. The business world and the sports world right now, with again the narrative, the cultural narratives that are out there. Listen, social media is constantly looking for a fight because all social media, all digital media, I don't care if it's watching the news, listening to the news, scrolling through social media, they want to monetize. That's the number one goal. Eyeballs, monetize. So we teach kids now and adults will talk about digital media is, guys, there's an agenda: monetize, desensitize, polarize, and politicize. The fight, I say polarize because nothing draws eyeballs like a fight. So everything that's coming from the media out there, wherever our media source is, they've lost sight of truth and facts, and they've given in. Again, this is treasure because eyeballs are money, and money is what the game is about. And so we've now, instead of making sure the facts are right, we're now racing to just get stuff out there because it sells and it draws. And that's wreaking havoc both on our athletes and people in the business world, because like you said, it's building the anxiety, and it's also building the comparison game where everybody's going, oh, that person's got it better than me, so I should have this. And so it's driving that envy and driving more and more of that treasure. I got to get that. I should get that. So it's really playing to those two motivators in both worlds. And I wish I had the ultimate answer right now, other than I can tell you the last 5 years, I've spent a lot more time not only researching and studying it, but teaching both in business and in sports about the dangers and the realities of what's happening in our media world, in our digital media world, and how much we're consuming and how dangerous that consumption is becoming to our leadership because it's impacting our hearts. So I could talk a lot more on that. And that's a rabbit.
That's actually very good. I know as a coach, I struggle with what's on social media, what's important on social media, why it's important or why it's not important. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of it. I'm involved with it because I have to be in recruiting, that type of thing. But I'm not a huge fan of it because I feel like it's not always very real. And that's what I want to do is I want to get down in the trenches where it's real with an athlete. And so I'm going to ask you this question. Because faith is so important to me, and I know it's important to you. How would you tell a coach who is of faith, if you will, to be able to coach a player? And it's different at a public university than it is at a private university. At Baylor, I'm expected to share my faith, but at a public institution like Oklahoma State, I was not. So how would you encourage a coach to do that? And I say by example, but what would you say?
Yeah, well, that's number one by far. And I'll go back to, guys like Tony Bennett, who's at Virginia, and Dabo Sweeney, who's at, these guys are who they say they are. And, I've spent enough time in both those programs to know that they live it. They are, to your point, they are truly an example. But I will also say that, and then this goes back to our digital world and the overarching cultural narratives out there. There's way too much out there that is kind of theory about what you can and can't say. Out in the real world, you don't push anything on anybody. You don't have to. You can't make your kids go read the Bible. You got to do that, But what you can do is you can share who you really are, and you can share how that experience has impacted your life, and you can model those truths and those principles to the highest standard. If you talk about it once in a while, say something about it, but yet your life is an absolute train wreck in terms of, you're addicted to all kinds of chemical numbing, sources out there, and the kids can see it. They can see that you're miserable all the time. They can see that you care about one thing, and that's winning championships, and that's it. They can see that stuff. And so, just like we were talking about earlier, how they can see if your faith is real or not. And I think that's such a powerful thing. The kids are going to be drawn to that. The positive of all of the stuff that's going on in culture, in my mind right now, is I think that kids, as much as it's, scary for them and maybe even driving this anxiety and a lot of these other that we're dealing with more, their hearts are more open to hear the truth and see that they're looking for models. They're looking for people who are actually living it out and what they say. And here they say, I'm not forcing you. You don't have to believe how I believe, but you're going to see a picture of genuine love from me, unconditional love in every way, shape, or form. And I'm going to push you as hard as I can because I'm going to hold you accountable, because my belief is that we're called to be our best at whatever it is that we're doing. We're going to work at it with all our hearts, and there's so many of those biblical principles that work.
Mm-hmm.
They've been proven. And so, there's just, I always encourage coaches. I think we're at a time where now more than ever, be who you really say you are, walk the talk, and that goes back to when you say, gosh, I got to keep my job. I I always tell my friends, my especially the ones that they're Christian friends, that they will tell me their faith is really important to them. And I'm saying, hey, then at some point you're going to be tested and you're going to have to trust God to take the reins for you. There's going to be something. There's going to be some recruiting call or something where there's a balance between, I should be with my family right now, or I could spend another 3 hours doing this. Listen, you know what? I'm going to trust God, and He's going to take care of this. And I'm not saying slack, because that's complacency really isn't something you have to worry about with anybody that's a head coach these days.
Right.
They didn't get there by being complacent. But there's always that, hey, it's always the balance of, can you really trust that this is going to take care of itself? Okay. And I'm going to trust the path. And maybe I'm not supposed to be here any longer. Maybe I am supposed to move into a new area where I'm going to impact somebody else for some, reason that I'll never know generations down the road. So.
Well said. Well said. So I'm going to ask you another question and that was all great information, but if you had a favorite coach of all times, who would it be and why? Just somebody you've witnessed. It might have been the coach you talked about you played for, but what would be your favorite coach and why?
Oh man, that's so, I'll cheat and I'll say that from the past, it would definitely be Wooden.
Okay.
There's just the faith, the character components, the example, the fact that it took him 13 years to start winning.
Yep.
But it was the foundation that he was building. And so he would definitely be, there's so many guys that, guys that are out there now that I just have so much respect for, that I know have been successful in their past. They're successful now. They're leading in the right ways. Dabo is who he says he is as a football coach. But, Tony Bennett, Scott Drew, Mike McGraw. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's one of those guys that I know because I've seen how he works, because we've talked a lot about your system of what you do every season and how detailed you are with, tracking everything that happens and some of the amazing detail. People don't realize the detail that goes into what you do. I haven't forgotten that stuff, Mike. I've paid close attention to how you do what you do. And so I do. It's hard for me because, I've got those coaches in virtually every sport. There's a bunch of them at Baylor because I spent a bunch of time at Baylor, but there's also a bunch of them around the country. So it's hard to pinpoint one.
Well, that was kind of an unfair question, and I didn't prepare you for that one. So
that's all right. No, I love that though, but there's a lot of great ones out there.
I do very well agree. I've read everything on John Wooden about him, written by him, whatever. I think he had a great simplistic view of how to motivate guys, and he lived out what his creed was, which is great, which I really love. So if I can go back to your book, and we talk about Coach Rocker, and we said Steve Rocker is like most coaches at some point. And wouldn't you say that he had to actually evolve through this process of that season? And if so, how did he do it and why did he do it? Because he'd been successful for a long, long time before this slapped him in the face. So how would you encourage a coach who's kind of set in his ways to understand maybe I could change some things that would benefit me and definitely my athletes? How would you encourage a coach like that?
Well, I think that's a really, really tough one too. It's interesting, the old saying, it says people don't change until the pain of staying the same exceeds the pain of change.
Oh, wow.
There's a part of that I believe there's a lot of truth in that. And I think that's often the case. I would also say that people change as a result of love. I still would tell you that I believe love is the greatest motivator on the face of the earth. So even if you go back to, the story of Urban Meyer and kind of where he was after Florida and the heart change that he went through, it was painful. He thought he was having a heart attack. He really was ignoring his family. He had his daughter say some things at a press conference about him being gone all the time, that really there was some pain that hit him. But I would always go to that and go, okay, wait a minute, why was that painful? And in his case, it was painful because it was about love. It was about those he loved the most. And he had lost sight of that. He'd really kind of forgotten that for a long time. And I think that's what a lot of times happens in the coaching world. We sometimes lose sight of, why did I really get into this? When, can I go back to a time, did I ever really love the opportunity to impact these athletes and love these kids, and love the coaches and love the, or was it really only about me? And so, this is where I go back to that why question. And there has to be at some point eyes and heart being open to, have I been deceiving myself? And in what ways have I been deceiving myself? Because we all have a capacity for self-deception for sure. But it's recognizing it at some point of, am I there? Have I been there? Is this really why I'm going after it? And the fact of the matter is, there are some coaches out there, when they open their eyes to the reality of, this is what it's about, I'm gonna make a lot of money, I love the sport, I love the juice, the thrill of the kill and all that other stuff. That's fine. And you can win that way too. At times there are programs out there that coaches win that way. And, I think that's fine for some and how they did. That's not what I aspire to. It's not what I teach. It's not what I would tell you is the best way, what I believe. But there are some guys out there with multiple national championships that would sit across from me and go, you know what, Todd, I care about the kids. But when it comes right down to it, this is better for them. This is how you should do it. And this is the way it works. And it's worked for them. I get it. I disagree. Doesn't matter how many championship rings you have. I can show you others that are doing it the right way that also have championship rings. So I can tell you there's a couple ways to do it. Just depends on where your heart is.
You know, you say that. I've got a really great example, a lot of great examples here at Baylor, but Scott Drew is certainly one of those. He's been doing it right since day one.
Yeah.
You know him as an Indiana boy from way back, but I've only known him as a Baylor guy. And he took over a really tough situation here at Baylor, and he said we were going to win championships one day. And he never forgot about his roots. He never forgot about what he had said and what he wanted to do. He never abandoned what he believed. And they may never win another championship, and he might win several more. But I love the way he takes care of his business. He's one of my favorite coaches.
Yeah, no doubt. One of mine too. And I think you are spot on, and I think he's a great example of that. And he and I have had a lot of these conversations exactly about that. Talked about the contrast, and some of the coaches do it this way, some of them, and some win both ways. And so I'll never say, well, this is the only way to do it. This is the only way you can win. If winning is truly, if that's the end all be all, I'm going to leave a legacy of winning. Then, if I get put a gun to somebody's head, I can get them to do almost anything really fast. So I'm not going to dispute the fact that fears and, the prospect of a pro contract and the prospect of winning a national championship every 2 or 3 years, that treasure is so big. And there's a ton of kids going to play because they know that they're going to probably win a national championship every 3 years at least, and they're going to get an NFL contract. On the other hand, there's a bunch of kids going to a place to play where they know that they're getting constant exposure to a bunch of faith principles, that there's a deep, genuine love that is at the foundation of everything they're doing. It's not to say that there's not great relationships at the other place. It's just that this one is really genuinely built on that more than anything else. And it's an eternal perspective. And that's where Scott has, he stayed true to that. And it's been awesome to see him, patiently make that climb to where he is now. So, yeah,
from the faith perspective, I didn't think any more of him the day after they won that national championship than I did the day before. I love the way he coaches, the way he motivates, his energy, that type of thing. So that's why winning is not the thing. And I've done my fair share of winning. I've been successful. That's been great. And I've seen some dark times too. And I just want every young coach. I hosted a College Golf Fellowship Young Coaches Retreat in January at my home. We had 12 coaches between the age of 24 to 28. And it was an absolute pleasure having those kids. We did some Bible studies. Obviously, I had Travis Wolf and Marcus Jones from College Golf Fellowship do the Bible studies, but I did a clinic one day. And what I wanted to get across to them was, you're going to coach for another 35 years until you're my age, or 30 years. And I need you to understand this winning deal. It's wonderful. And who doesn't like winning? Who doesn't want to try to win? We all do. We're competitors. Right. Yeah. But we don't win very often. So what are you going to hang your hat on? And what are you going to rest on if you don't win? What is it? And that's what I loved out of your book was Coach Rocker finally coming to that conclusion. It wasn't about the winning, and he had to have a janitor, Joe the janitor, kind of show him what was really important. It was an amazing. I got to tell you, the first 110 pages were great, but I really loved the end of that book. I read that over and over and over, and I don't know if you lucked into it, you stumbled upon it, how it came about, but it's a really great conclusion to a book. Tell me, how did you come to that?
Yeah, it was the I tell people all the time, and we don't want to give away too much because there are surprises, there are twists in the end of that book for sure. And I would tell you that I did not know who Joe was going to be. I didn't know how it was going to end up. I didn't know what was going to end up with the season. The book, all of the things the unique things that happened, I didn't know any of those things were going to happen when I first wrote those first words. When I said, "Lead for God's sake," said Coach Rocker as he stumped, as he slammed the door to the locker, and I just didn't know where it was going, and so I stumbled on a lot of like I told you earlier, and I know you know this. I stumbled on a lot of help from above. I was at a place where, I had, and I prayed a lot before I wrote that book, and had come to peace with my motives for writing it. I did not want it to be about promoting. A lot of people, they start a consulting business, then they write a book to promote the consulting business. And I wrote the book because I felt I was supposed to write it, and I didn't really know what I was going to do with it. I didn't know where it was going to go. I thought, well, if it helps a few of my friends in the business world and in the sports world, then it's served its purpose. And I want my kids to have those principles if something should ever happen to me. And that was really where those were the motives that I left it at when I set out to write that. And thank God that, he had a much, much bigger plan than I could have ever anticipated. Never in my wild imagination. I mean, there's been so many times, Mike, where I've sat with coaches, like yourself. I've gotten emails from guys that have, in essence, in a lot of cases, they've been legends in their sport and in their work, and I'm sitting in their office sometimes going, I don't belong here. I have no business being here. The cool thing is over the last 10 years, he's put me in enough of those places where now as a 52-year-old, or just about, I'll be turned 52 in a month. But, I was talking to a head football coach, actually of an SEC school, really young guy, just a couple of weeks ago, and wants me to come in and do some stuff with his team. And I was talking to him about more of the Joe role, where I'm really, and I said, somehow when I started this journey, I just turned 40. And I said, somehow all of a sudden I became the old guy because these coaches in college, in a lot of college sports, there's tons of them that are in their 30s, now and in their 40s. And so it's like, well, now all of a sudden it's kind of like I've had the opportunity to spend enough time with some of those older ones that it's kind of like, my heart is to continue to, pour into those young ones now in as any ways I can. Because I think that's a key need out there for coaches these days.
Well, I told you about that conference, that retreat that I hosted for young coaches. That might be an idea for you. Get them when they're young so that they don't have to experience all the pain that a guy like me went through. I mean, I would want to have had you mentoring me when I was 25. I think I would have probably circumvented some of those issues I had. But before we finish up here, I want you to, first of all, tell everybody where they can get your book, Lead for God's Sake. Where can they get that, Todd?
The best place, the fastest these days, everybody knows it's Amazon.com. If you're a Prime member, man, you're reading it tomorrow if you want. Obviously, it's available on iTunes and audio, all of the normal electronic platforms. So you can get it in any format. It really, as far as I know, it's still available in, Barnes and Noble across the country, and Books A Million is the other one I think that has it across the country, or at least usually does. I'll occasionally, I used to always go to the bookstores and make sure they still had it. Nowadays, I haven't gotten out as much, but that's an early one.
Copy. Mine's all dog-eared and highlighted and notes in the column. I'm going to keep on reading it. It's been a great, I don't know, sort of a manual for me. It leads me well, if you will. It's a great book to recharge my coaching batteries about once every year or so. I really, really enjoy it. So, Todd, thank you so much for coming on and just sharing some of your wisdom today. And I hope young coaches are listening. It's a great, great place to be if you can lead for God's sake.
Well, Coach, I can't tell you how much I appreciate, all that you stand for. You truly leave it better than you found it.
Okay.
Every way, shape, or form. And I will tell you, and I read that book that you wrote and loved it. And I've told different coaching friends, and it's been cool to actually hear some friends that I know have read that, and I think young coaches would do well to read that book, because you truly are a great model of what we talked about today, and I appreciate that. So it's been an honor to be on your show.
Again for coming onto the podcast today, and hopefully one day we'll both have written another book and we can have a podcast about that.
Absolutely. I'm hoping and praying, both of them.
All right. Well, thanks again, Todd. Have a great day.